Hey there. Welcome to Dark Lullabies. How was your day? I'm so glad you're here, and I really hope I can help you relax and find some peace tonight. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Okay, let's get started with the first story. Story 1. I grew up in a narrow valley in southern West Virginia. One of those Appalachian towns where the mountains feel like walls and the sky is just a strip of blue threaded between ridgelines. In my early 20s, I lived about 40 minutes outside Charleston, in a sagging rental house off a winding road that clung to the side of the hill. And I'd just crawled out of a messy 3-year relationship that left me feeling hollowed out and strangely weightless, like it'd stepped out of my life and hadn't quite landed in a new one yet. Every day felt the same. It'd wake up to the sound of coal trucks grinding their gears on the grade, drive to a warehouse job I hated, come home, microwave something beige, and pretend that scrolling my phone in the dark counted as living. My grandmother, on the other hand, moved through that same world with this unshakable steadiness that half comforted me and half scared me. After my grandfather died, a retired miner and Vietnam vet who knew every name and every story in our hollow, she started going to church even more than before. Not just Sunday mornings, but Wednesday nights. Women's, Bible study, potlucks, funerals for people I barely knew. It was as if grief pushed her deeper into the routines that gave her life shape. And one day, when she called and asked if I'd drive her to the little white clapboard church up on the ridge because her knees weren't what they used to be, I said yes, more out of guilt than conviction. At first, I told myself I was only there for her, helping her up the cracked steps, wading through the hymns and sermons like someone killing time in a hospital waiting room. But there was a part of me that liked the predictability of it, the same faces, the same coffee in styrofoam cups, the same old organ wheezing, the same old songs while the ceiling fans pushed around warm air that smelled like floor polish and perfume. My grandmother would close her eyes when the pastor prayed, lips moving, hands folded so tightly her knuckles whitened, and afterward she'd squeeze my arm and say she knew my grandfather was with the Lord now, that she could feel peace about it, and I would nod and pretend I understood. I didn't, not really, but I envied that certainty, like you envy money or health, you can't fake it, and I didn't have it. It was one of those heavy, late summer Sundays, heat shimmering over the parking lot. When I met her, the church sat on a ridge that looked out over a patchwork of trailers, old farmhouses, and half-collapsed barns. And after the service, everyone spilled out onto the gravel, squinting against the sun, swapping gossip about mines and layoffs and whose cousin had relapsed. I was leaning against my car, halfway thinking about leaving, when I noticed a girl standing alone by the side entrance, partly in the shade of a maple tree. I was sure I'd never seen her before. And in a town like ours, that alone made her feel almost unreal. She had dark, tightly curled hair that fell just past her shoulders, a pale scar along her jaw that caught the light when she turned her head, and hazel eyes that seemed too bright and too watchful for someone her age. Her clothes weren't anything special. Faded jeans, a black t-shirt, boots scuffed white at the toes, but there was this tension in the way she held herself, like she was always bracing for something to happen. I remember thinking she looked both older and younger than me at the same time, as if some parts of her life had gone too fast while others had never started. I don't know what pushed me over. Maybe boredom, maybe loneliness, maybe the way the other church members flowed around her like water around a rock. But I found myself walking over, making some clumsy comment about how hot it was. She smiled, small and guarded, and said her name was Lena, that her family had moved down from Ohio a few months back because her stepfather picked up work at a natural gas site outside town. Her voice was soft, but not shy, like someone who'd spent a lot of time listening before she ever bothered to speak. When I asked what brought her to this particular church, she shrugged and said her mother liked small places where people still pretend they know each other, then half laughed, as if she'd said too much. We didn't talk long, but something clicked in that easy, awkward way where you're suddenly aware of standing too close and smiling too hard. There were almost no jokes and hardly any flirting, just this steady current underneath the conversation, like we both recognized a kind of quiet damage in the other and instinctively leaned toward it. The first horror detail slipped in so casually I didn't recognize it as anything at the time. When my grandmother realized who I was talking to, she came shuffling over, all warmth and polite questions. And for the briefest second, as Lena turned to greet her, I saw a battered white pickup idling at the far edge of the lot, dust gathering in the still air around its tires. The driver was a thick-shouldered man in a ball cap, forearm dangling out the window, a cigarette burning down between his fingers. He wasn't looking at the church or the view or his phone. He was staring straight at Lena with this flat, practiced focus, eyes that didn't move when she moved. And as soon as she noticed him, she went rigid, shoulders rising, that scar along her jaw whitening as she clenched her teeth. My grandmother was asking her the usual small-town questions. Who's your mama? Where are you living? Do y'all have enough groceries? And Lena answered politely, but like someone reciting lines, gaze fixed on a point over Gran's shoulder. By the time I looked back at the truck, it was already rolling down the hill, brake lights flashing once before it disappeared around the bend. Gran didn't seem to notice any of it, just squeezed Lena's hand and told her we hoped to see her again. On the drive home, she said, Lena seemed like a sweet girl with too much on her mind, and then, more quietly, that some men ought to be locked away from the day they're born, which made no sense to me until later, when Lena finally let some details slip about her stepfather and the biological father she wouldn't talk about at all. Over the next week, Lena and I began texting. It started with a simple hey from her that I pretended not to be thrilled about, then turned into a steady stream of messages, music, memes, fragments of our days. She didn't use social media much, and only had a half-finished Instagram account with a handful of grainy photos. A picture of the hills at dusk, a thrift store mirror with "Don't Disappear" written in soap across it, a stray dog sleeping in the bed of a truck. No selfies, no friends tagged, no old life to scroll back into. Just the bare outline of someone trying to exist without being seen. Whenever our conversation brushed up against family, she stiffened, even over text. She told me her stepfather drank hard and mean, that their place at the end of a rutted road up another hollow felt more like a bunker than a home, that Shed changed schools so many times. Shed stopped learning people's names. She hinted that leaving Ohio hadn't been about opportunity, but about getting away from someone whose name she refused to type, as if writing it might conjure him. There were no wild confessions, no melodramatic lines, just matter-of-fact details that landed heavier than anything my ex had ever thrown at me in an argument. It made the way Shed smiled in the sun outside church feel like even more of a miracle. I didn't ask her on a date right away because I assumed I'd see her the next Sunday. And I was right. That morning, the church felt different the moment we walked in, though I couldn't have told you why. The sanctuary was always dim in a comforting way, the stained glass muddy with age and coal dust. But now the light seemed especially murky, and I noticed for the first time that someone had duct-taped a crack along the base of one of the side windows, as if something had hit it from outside. Maybe it was just my imagination, but the air smelled faintly of bleach underneath the usual perfume and coffee, and when the choir finished their hymn, there was a brief stutter of silence, like everyone was waiting for something else to happen. During the offering, Gran nudged me to help her to the bathroom, and we ended up taking the side hallway that led past the fellowship hall and down toward the basement rooms where they held Sunday school for the little kids. A fluorescent light flickered overhead in that headache-inducing way, humming louder than it should have, and as we passed the last classroom door, I heard the second horror detail, a muffled, rhythmic thudding from inside, followed by something that sounded like a low, wordless chant. It wasn't a song, not in any language I recognized. And it wasn't children's voices. It was deeper, slower, like someone talking to themselves or praying under their breath in the dark. My skin prickled, and I paused with my hand on the doorknob, but Gran tugged my arm and said the class didn't meet anymore, that they'd closed that room off last year after an incident she didn't want to explain. The sound stopped as suddenly as if someone had flipped a switch, and when I glanced back, the narrow window in the upper part of the door reflected only our own shapes. distorted by old glass. I told myself it was pipes, or the air conditioner, or my brain trying to scare me because it'd been listening to too many podcasts. Still, when we came back through the sanctuary, and I saw Lena sitting alone in the last pew, I felt more than just attraction or curiosity. I felt relief, like some part of me believed that as long as she was in the room, whatever was wrong with the building or the people or the valley would be held at bay. After the service, I finally asked if she'd want to hang out sometime. And she said yes, without drama. Just a quick nod and a smile that reached her eyes for the first time. We settled on a movie and something to eat the following Friday. That whole week I moved through my routine with an odd kind of lightness, thinking about what it'd say, worrying about my car's check engine light, imagining a normal night where nothing went wrong. When Friday came, the movie was forgettable, and the diner we hit afterward was noisy and bright. All chrome and faded photos of coal tipples on the walls. But being across from her made the whole scene feel sharpened, significant. She didn't dominate the conversation or spill her entire life story, but she listened like it mattered, asking small, precise questions about my grandfather, my half-finished attempts at community college, the way the mountains made me feel both protected and trapped. Every now and then she'd drift, eyes going distant as if she were hearing something I couldn't, then snap back with an apology and a joke, laugh too quickly, fingers tightening around her glass. I noticed she jumped at sudden noises, the crash of plates in the kitchen, a truck backfiring outside, and that she always sat with her back to the wall facing the door. These were all little things, the kind you rationalize away when you're happy someone is even sitting across from you. But if I let myself replay that night now, I can't help seeing them as warnings written in a language I didn't yet know how to read. When the meal ended, I didn't want to take her home yet, and she didn't seem eager to go back either. So I suggested we drive up along the ridge road that cut across the mountain toward the next county, the one where the tree canopy closes over the two-lane like a tunnel, and you can sometimes pull off at a gravel overlook to see the town lights far below. She hesitated, glancing at the window where her reflection floated over the dark parking lot, then said, "Sure," in a tone that sounded more resigned than excited. Outside, the air had cooled, the sky bruised purple over the ridges. We climbed into my car, this aging sedan that rattled like a jar of bolts on rough pavement, and I pulled onto the highway that quickly narrowed and twisted, the yellow lines winking in and out as the road curved. The third horror detail unfolded in stages, so slowly it almost blended into the normal unease of night driving in the mountains. First, there was the roadkill, a deer. I thought at first sprawled half on the shoulder, half in our lane, forcing me to ease into the opposite lane to avoid it. My headlights swept across its body, and for a heartbeat everything was washed in harsh white. I saw that it wasn't just a deer that had been hit. Its belly had been slit open in a neat, deliberate line. Organs pulled out and arranged in a rough circle around it. Something dark and wet smeared across the asphalt like a crude symbol. The stink hit us through the vents, sharp and metallic, and Lena made a low sound in her throat, not quite a gasp. She clutched the strap of her seatbelt with both hands, knuckles pale. I told myself some sick hunter had done it for a laugh, that it was just rural cruelty, not a message, not a ritual, but the back of my neck wouldn't stop tingling. A mile or two later, I noticed headlights appear in the rearview mirror, far back at first, then closer still until the vehicle behind us was riding my bumper. High beams on, washing the inside of the car in artificial daylight. I could see nothing but glare in the mirror. Couldn't even make out the shape of the grille. And every time I sped up a little, they sped up too, staying right there, pressing. Lena went absolutely silent beside me, breathing shallow and fast, eyes fixed straight ahead. I thought about pulling off at a small gravel turnout, but something in me balked at the idea of stopping on the side of a dark mountain road with whoever that was directly behind us. Then, just when it decided to slow down and let them pass, their lights cut out completely for a few seconds, plunging the road behind us into black. When they flicked back on, the car or truck, whatever it was gone. No curve for it to have turned off, no driveway, no fork in the road, just empty pavement unspooling in my rear view. I swallowed, told myself they must have turned off their lights and pulled into some hidden logging road I didn't see, or that I'd misjudged the distance and they'd actually dropped back. But the rattling of my car suddenly seemed louder, the trees thicker, the dark outside the windows more solid. What happened next is the part my mind runs its fingers over on bad nights, searching for a seam or a trick or some clue that would make it all make sense. We were maybe 20 minutes out of town, the radio low, the tires humming, when Lena's breathing changed. It went from fast and shallow to slow and measured, like someone counting silently. I glanced over and saw her sitting very straight, hands relaxed now in her lap, eyes unfocused. At first, I thought she was falling asleep, worn out from the tension of the last hour. But then her lips parted, and she began to speak in a rapid, low stream of sound. It wasn't English, or if it was, the words were chewed and tangled beyond recognition. It almost sounded like she was repeating a phrase over and over, but I couldn't catch any pattern. There was a rhythm to it, though, a cadence that made the hair on my arm stand up because it reminded me of that chant I'd heard outside the closed Sunday school room. Her eyes rolled upward until only the whites showed, not in a horror movie snap, but in a slow, unnatural drift, and her head started to tremble in tiny jerks, like she was fighting something inside herself. My brain tried to put it in boxes it knew: seizure, panic attack, flashback, but none of those quite fit the way her voice stayed so eerily steady while her body twitched. The car drifted toward the double yellow lines as I stared at her, and I had to wrench my attention back to the road, swerving hard enough that the tires shrieked. A horn blared from somewhere ahead. A truck I hadn't even seen was suddenly on us, its own lights exploding across the windshield as it roared past, missing us by what felt like inches. My heart slammed against my ribs, and I pulled us onto the gravel shoulder, stones spitting out under the tires, the car shuddering to a stop in a spray of dust. For a few long seconds, all I could hear was the ticking of the engine, and Lena's voice, that same stream of muttered syllables, faster now, more urgent. My hands shook as I fumbled for my phone, fingers clumsy on the emergency number. I told the dispatcher there was a girl in my car who might be having a seizure or some kind of episode, that we were on the Ridge Road past mile marker 12, that I didn't know what to do. My voice sounded thin and young to my own ears. While I was talking, Lena's head snapped to the side, neck muscles tightening, and she fell silent, mid-sentence. Her eyes rolled back down and locked onto mine with a wild clarity that made my stomach drop. There was no confusion in her gaze, no post-seizure fog like you see on medical shows, just a huge, naked fear. Not of dying, or not understanding what was happening, but of me, or of where she was, or maybe of some memory that had suddenly yanked her backwards. Her breathing hitched, once, twice. Then she lunged for the door handle, before I could even process what she was doing. She'd thrown the door open and was out in the dark, boots skidding on gravel. I shouted her name, the phone slipping from my shoulder into my lap, but she was already running full speed toward the tree line as if something far more terrifying than the woods was at her back. Branches snapped as she plunged into the undergrowth, and in the brief sweep of my headlights I saw her dark hair vanish between the trunks, swallowed by the forest that pressed right up to the edge of the road. I'd like to tell you I leaped out and chased her without thinking, that I pushed through the brambles in deadfall calling her name until my throat bled, but the truth is I froze. Every story I'd ever heard about people getting lost or hurt or shot in those woods rushed into my mind at once. I pictured her stepfather's face in that idling truck, the gutted deer on the road, the chanting behind the church door, the vanishing headlights, and I sat there gripping the steering wheel, while my heart pounded so hard, my vision blurred. The dispatcher was still on the line, asking if I was safe, if the girl was breathing, if there were any landmarks nearby. I forced myself to answer in broken bursts, eyes fixed on the place where the trees had closed behind her. Time warped a couple minutes, stretched into something longer, and by the time the first set of red and blue lights washed across the curve in the road, I felt like I'd been sitting in that car for hours, the scent of hot engine oil and dust thick in my nose. The deputies and paramedics took my story more seriously than I expected. Maybe my shaking hands and the skid marks on the pavement helped. Or maybe they'd seen enough strange things up in those hills to know better than to scoff. I told them everything. The church, the truck in the parking lot, the dead deer, the car that had ridden my bumper and vanished. The way Lena had started speaking like someone possessed by a thought too big for words. The way Shed looked at me before she ran. Saying it out loud made it sound crazier, not less. Like a patchwork of details from thrillers and true crime shows I'd stitched together in my head. But they never once told me I was imagining it. They shined their flashlights along the tree line, called her name, and eventually, when more units arrived, they went into the woods in a loose line, their lights bobbing between the trunks. I sat on the hood of my car with a foil blanket around my shoulders, my grandmother's number pulled up on my phone but my thumb unable to hit call. After what felt like forever, one of the deputies came back, face lined in a way that said he'd seen enough bad endings to recognize their shapes. They hadn't found her. Not that night. They took a formal statement at the station, had me scroll through my messages with her, wrote down the number she had given me. They said they'd contact her family, file a report, keep an eye out. No one accused me of anything, but I could feel the unspoken questions hanging in the air. Who was this girl, really? And what had I actually seen? And what did I think I could have done differently when a person decided to fling themselves into the dark? In the days and weeks afterward, I went back to the church. Not because I expected to see her there, but because I didn't know where else to go. She never showed. Her number went dead the next day. Not even voicemail. Just that hollow, immediate failure tone. When I checked her Instagram, it gave me a blank page. User not found, like Shed erased herself in one clean swipe. I asked around discreetly, did anyone know Elena, whose family had just moved in from Ohio, whose stepfather worked the gas sites, whose mother liked small churches where people still pretend they know each other? But all I got were shrugs and half-remembered rumors about some folks up that way who don't mix much. When I mentioned her last name, which I'd only seen on the intake form the police had me fill out, one older lady frowned and said that was the same as a family that used to live 2 hollows over, the ones who had some trouble with the law and moved on years back. She couldn't say whether they were related. Maybe there are paper trails somewhere, reports, transfers, school records that trace the path Lena's life took after she left that car, but if there are, I don't have access to them. What I do have is the image of her running toward the trees, as if they offered a kind of safety the rest of the world never had, and the memory of her eyes when she looked at me like I was the last thing pinning her to this reality and she had to cut that thread to survive. I don't live in that valley anymore. I moved to a different state, different job, different landscape, where the horizon is wider and the hills don't crowd so close. But sometimes, late at night, when traffic noise fades and everything is very still, they'll think I hear that low, steady cadence of her voice again. Not as something supernatural, but as an echo of a mind breaking along lines someone else carved into it long before I ever knew her. If you've made it this far, and you've ever met someone who seemed to slip out of your life in an instant with more questions than answers, tell me in the comments what you think really happened to her. Because after all these years, I still don't know if she was running from something, toward something, or straight off the edge of the world we were both barely holding on to. Story 2. My name is Daniel, and I still think about that night every time I see dark clouds stack up over the mountains. A few summers ago, I was driving alone through the central Appalachians, cutting across West Virginia on my way back home to eastern Tennessee after visiting my buddy Marcus in Ohio. One of those friends you don't see for years but fall back into step with like no time has passed at all. We had spent 3 days drinking cheap beer on his apartment balcony, talking about everything and nothing while freight trains wailed in the distance. And by the time I left, I felt tired in that good, heavy way, like my mind had finally had room to stretch. I drove an old 2011 Ford Focus my parents had basically dumped on me when they upgraded. A car that should have been retired a decade ago, but somehow kept hanging on out of pure spite. The brakes were spongy. The engine would randomly shudder at stoplights. The radio cut out if you hit a pothole too hard. And half the dashboard lights were permanently lit like a Christmas tree nobody remembered to unplug. The worst part, though the part that actually made it dangerous, was that the windshield wipers barely worked. They'd moved from weak to useless over the course of a year, and I kept telling myself I'd replace them on my next paycheck. The same way you keep telling yourself you'll start eating better after this week. I'd planned my drive carefully, since the mountains are unpredictable. The route wound through long stretches of forest and small towns that clung to the sides of hollows, past shuttered coal tipples and rusting equipment left to sink back into the hills. The highway wasn't really a highway at all, just a two-lane that twisted and climbed and dropped with the terrain, the kind of road where you memorize every guardrail, scar, and rockslide sign. The weather apps all said partly cloudy, which in that part of the world can mean anything from blue skies to biblical flooding. But I decided to trust the forecast. For the first few hours, everything went smoothly. Just me, the road, and the steady rhythm of trucks hauling timber and coal, their engines echoing off the rock, faces like distant thunder. I'd been driving most of the day when I hit the first horror note, a small gas station tucked into the crook of a valley, the kind of place you stop at out of necessity rather than choice. The sky was already dimming with heavy cloud cover, and I figured I should top off the tank and grab something to drink before pressing into the more remote stretch of the drive. The lot was mostly empty, except for an old pickup with a missing tailgate and a motorcycle with saddlebags sagging like tired eyes. Inside, the fluorescent lights flickered, buzzing faintly, and the air smelled like old coffee and floor cleaner. I grabbed a bottle of water and headed to the restroom before paying. The bathroom was down a narrow hallway near the back, and as soon as I stepped in, I noticed the bulletin board on the wall opposite the door, layer upon layer of faded flyers, business cards, and handwritten notes. At first, it seemed normal yard sales, guitar lessons, church events. But then my eyes locked onto a cluster of missing person posters. There were more than I expected, more than felt normal for a town this small. A teenage boy in a football jersey, a woman somewhere in her 30s holding a toddler, an older man with sunken cheeks. One flyer had been partially torn away, leaving only the top half of a girl's face, and the words, "Last seen near Coal Ridge" in bold black letters. Someone had circled those words in red ink, hard enough to rip the paper beneath, and scrawled "Don't drive it alone" beside them. The ink had run in places, dragged by what I told myself was water, but looked a lot like the smeared trail a thumb leaves when it presses too hard over fresh writing. I stood there a second too long, suddenly very aware of the hum of the light and the thinness of the walls. Then shook it off, used the bathroom, and paid for my drink. The guy behind the counter never looked up from his phone, and for some reason that bothered me more than if he'd been staring. Back on the road, the sky went from gray to bruise-colored fast. The mountains have their own rules, and the storm rolled over them like someone flipping a switch. The first fat raindrops hit my windshield and smeared into long, oily streaks because the glass was already coated in summer dust and bug guts. I tried the wipers out of habit and got that familiar useless squeak as they dragged across the water, barely moving it. Within minutes, the drizzle turned into a wall of rain so thick my headlights just bounced back at me. The road disappeared into a blur of white and black, painted lines swallowed in reflection. I knew if I kept going, it'd eventually drift across a lane or miss a curve and end up in a ravine, so I did the only thing that made sense. I pulled off. There wasn't a proper shoulder, not really, just an unmarked gravel cutout someone had carved into the hillside years ago to turn logging trucks around. I guided the car onto it by inches, heart pounding, crunching over loose rock until I felt like I was far enough off the narrow pavement that a semi wouldn't clip me if it came barreling around the bend. Trees pressed in tight on one side, dense and dark, leaves thrashing under the assault of the rain, and on the other side the land fell away into nothing I could see. Just a void where the forest dropped into the hollow below. I killed the engine but kept the lights on for a minute, listening to the sudden absence of road noise and the relentless drum of water on the roof. Thunder rolled, not the sharp crack you hear out west, but long, drawn-out growls that echoed from ridge to ridge. I thought about calling my parents to tell them it'd be late, but I knew it would just worry them, and there was nothing they could do. The nearest town was miles behind me, and from the look of the map, the next was even farther ahead. There is a particular kind of loneliness you feel sitting in a small car in the middle of a mountain storm, where you are painfully aware that the only thing separating you from the elements is a layer of metal and glass that has already failed you in small ways. I tried to recline the seat and tell myself I'd just wait it out, maybe doze off. That was the plan, anyway. The second horror detail came when the lightning briefly eased, and my eyes adjusted to the dim. In the glow of my parking lights, I noticed the ground around my tires wasn't just gravel. Mixed in with the rocks were spent shotgun shells and crumpled beer cans, little pyramids of cigarette butts mashed into the mud near the tree line. A cluster of broken glass that looked like the remains of a bottle smashed against something over and over. When I leaned forward to peer out at the trees, I saw a narrow path beaten into the undergrowth, directly across from my front bumper, almost perfectly aligned with where it stopped. Like this stretch of gravel existed for people to park and walk into that patch of woods specifically, and there, a few feet in, nailed to a tree at a height that didn't quite make sense, was a tin road sign peppered with bullet holes, its surface scarred and rusted, edges curled in. Someone had painted over the faded letters with a rough symbol in black spray paint, something like an X inside a circle, drips running downward. It was probably just a place where bored guys came to drink and shoot at things out of town. But in that moment, with the storm howling and my car shaking under the wind, it felt like I had parked in the exact wrong spot, the one unmarked place on the map where people came to do things they didn't want anyone else to see. I told myself I was being dramatic, locked the doors anyway, turned off the lights to make the car less of a beacon, and clenched my jaw against the steady rise of unease in my chest. The rain kept on, hard and unforgiving. Time got weird, melting into a series of too loud heartbeats and the occasional burst of lightning that lit the interior of the car in stark white for a fraction of a second. At some point, I must have drifted into that shallow, not quite sleep, where your brain is still replaying every bad choice you've ever made. Because the next thing I remember clearly is opening my eyes to a complete absence of natural light. The storm was still raging, but the sky was fully dark now, and the only illumination came from the faint glow of my phone screen when I tapped it, and the occasional flash far away behind the clouds. I checked the time and realized it'd been there for over an hour, longer than I intended. My back ached from the position, and my mind started to circle the practical questions. How long could I wait before I'd have to risk driving blind just to get somewhere with a motel? Whether anyone would bother stopping if they saw my hazard lights in the curve. That's when I saw the first flash that didn't belong to the sky. It was small at first, a pinprick of bright white off to my right, down the road too clean and focused to be lightning. It flicked on and off in jerky movements, sweeping across the trees in a way that felt intentional, searching. Then another appeared beside it. Then a third. 3 separate beams bobbing and weaving through the darkness like fireflies on amphetamines. I stared, throat suddenly dry, telling myself it was probably just other drivers who'd pulled off somewhere down the road and were checking their vehicles, maybe hunters heading home late or someone helping with a breakdown. But the longer I watched, the clearer it became that the lights were moving, closing the distance between themselves and my parked car. They weren't staying in one spot, they were advancing, slowly, as if whoever held them was picking their way along the shoulder in the driving rain. That should have been reassuring, maybe. You break down in the middle of nowhere, you want someone to come along, right? Except nothing about the way those beams moved felt right. They weren't steady, deliberate sweeps. They jittered erratically, slicing across the road and the trees, and occasionally dropping out of sight completely, like the people carrying them were stumbling or dancing or not entirely in control of their limbs. I kept thinking about the shells and the beer cans and the bullet-scarred sign, the "Don't Drive It Alone" warning in red ink on that missing person flyer. Adrenaline burned through the fog of my earlier nap in an instant. The third horror detail was what finally drove me out of the car. As the beams came closer, I realized there was a pattern to their movement. I hadn't noticed before a long stretch of darkness, then a tight cluster of frantic motions, then stillness. Eventually, one of the flashlights lifted and aimed directly into my windshield, flooding the interior of my car with blinding white. It felt like someone had grabbed my face. I ducked instinctively, heart slamming. My first stupid thought was that they were just curious, that they'd seen the shape of my car on the side of the road and wanted to check on me. But before I could force myself to sit up and wave, the beam jerked upward, and I heard it a sharp, unmistakable crack that cut through the drum of rain, followed a heartbeat later by the echo, rolling up and down the hollow. A gunshot, close enough that I felt it in my chest. My fingers dug into the steering wheel, nails biting into the cracked leather. Another voice shouted something I couldn't make out over the storm, high-pitched and slurred, followed by laughter that sounded wrong, too loud, too drawn out, like someone performing the idea of laughter rather than actually feeling anything funny. When my eyes adjusted to the after image of the flashlight, I realized I could now make out the shapes behind the beams. 3 figures in dark, soaked clothes. No raincoats. One with something long slung over his shoulder that I didn't need much imagination to recognize as a rifle. Another seemed to be dragging something heavy along the ground, something that caught on the gravel and made a scraping sound that cut through me. A smaller shape trotted beside them, head low, tail between its legs, a dog maybe, ribs faintly visible in a brief glare, flinching with every flash and bang. There was nothing supernatural about any of it, nothing that couldn't be explained by drunk men with weapons and bad intentions out in the middle of the night, and somehow that was worse. I didn't think my body moved before my brain could list pros and cons. I grabbed my phone, slid my seat back as quietly as I could, and eased the driver's side door open just enough to slip out into the rain. The sound swallowed everything else, which I told myself might work in my favor. Water immediately soaked my clothes, chilling me to the bone. But fear kept me moving. I kept low, using the car as cover at first, then darted toward the tree line opposite that beaten path, choosing the side that seemed less used, less marked by other people. My shoes slipped on wet rock and mud, hands grabbing blindly at roots and branches. I found a spot behind a moss-coated boulder a few yards up the slope, heart going so loud I was sure anyone within 30 feet could hear it. From there, I could see my car in partial silhouette whenever the distant lightning flared or one of the flashlights swept past. I watched those 3 beams converge on the focus, painting it in cold white light. The figures now close enough that I could make out the shapes of their hats, the way their jeans clung to their legs with the wet. They circled my car slowly, shining lights in through each window, peering inside like kids in front of a fish tank. I heard one of them rap on the glass with the butt of his flashlight. Another leaned down to examine my plates. Every survival instinct I had screamed at me to stay still, stay small, stay invisible. I don't know how long that examination lasted, seconds, probably. Though it felt like an hour before one of them fired another shot, this time not into the air, but into the opposite bank of the hill, rock chips spitting. It was reckless, pointless, a flex for whoever else was there. The dog yelped and cowered against a leg, ears flattened. I bit down on my tongue so hard I tasted blood, terrified that any sound from me would carry. Eventually, the beams drifted away from my car, sliding back toward the road. I lost sight of them for a moment as they passed under my line of view, then saw them reappear on the far side, moving away, swallowed once more by the twisting dark of the highway. I waited until their glow was nothing, until the only light came again from the skies. Occasional tantrums in the faint blue rectangle of my phone where it trembled in my grip. In that moment, crouched on wet ground, shivering, I realized how completely alone I was, and how quickly something terrible could have happened if it'd been too trusting or too slow. My hand shook so badly I could barely tap the screen, but I managed to dial 911. I kept my voice as low as I could while still being heard, explaining to the dispatcher that I was parked on a mountain road in the middle of a storm, that armed men had approached my vehicle, fired shots, and then driven off. Probably. I gave the route number from the last sign I remembered and guessed at my mile marker, describing landmarks. The gas station ID passed the direction of my travel. The dispatcher's voice was calm, practiced, asking clarifying questions in a tone that felt almost unreal compared to the chaos around me. She told me to stay put, to stay hidden, that an officer was on his way as soon as he could safely get through the weather. Time twisted again. I watched the empty road, flinching at every distant set of headlights, afraid it was them circling back and praying it was a patrol car. Eventually, after what felt like both forever and not long enough, I saw the faint red and blue strobe cutting through the rain far down the curve. Seeing those colors stirred a complicated mix of relief and fresh fear. The fear that maybe Id overreacted, that Id looked paranoid, stupid, dramatic. The fear that whoever those guys were would see the same lights and decide not to come back, leaving only me and the memory of 3 flashlights in the dark. As the cruiser pulled in behind my car, angled slightly to shield us from any passing traffic, I forced my legs to move, scrambling down the slick slope, sliding the last couple of feet more than walking them. The officer stepped out and immediately noticed me, one hand hovering near his holster out of reflex, then relaxing when he realized I was the one Hod called. He looked weathered, like a man Hod worked these roads a long time, rain plastering his hair to his forehead. I told him everything in a rush, stumbling over details, pointing to where the men had been, the direction they'd gone, the shell casings on the ground, the bullet-scarred sign in the trees. He listened without interrupting much, his face mostly unreadable, the way people get when they've heard more stories than they can ever fully process. He walked the perimeter of my car with his flashlight, spotted the fresh footprints in the mud, the smudge of a palm on the passenger window, the crushed beer can someone had kicked near my rear bumper. But there was nothing more dramatic than that. No message carved into the glass, no blood, nothing that would turn this into anything more than a suspicious person's call on a stormy night. That should have relaxed me. It didn't. What unnerved me more than anything was how unsurprised he seemed. When I asked if this kind of thing happened a lot, people messing around out here during storms with guns and flashlights, he just shrugged and said the mountains have a way of hiding people who don't want to be found, that sometimes folks do stupid things when they're drunk or bored or angry and a long way from town. He didn't say the words illegal hunting or drugs or dumping ground, but they hung in the air between us. He offered to wait with me until the worst of the storm passed, maybe follow me to the next town to make sure I got to a motel safely. I accepted, because the idea of being alone again after everything that had just happened made my skin crawl. We sat in our vehicles for another half hour, his lights on, mine off, the 2 cars forming a temporary island of humanity in the middle of the dark. Eventually, the rain eased enough that my wipers could smear instead of fail, and I followed him down the mountain, tires hissing on the wet pavement, the bullet-riddled sign disappearing in my rear view as another anonymous piece of metal in a forest full of shadows. I checked into a budget motel off the next exit, hands still shaking when I signed the forms. I didn't sleep much, replaying every second in my head, wondering what would have happened if I hadn't woken up when I did, if it'd left the interior lights on, if it'd stayed in the driver's seat when that first flashlight beam hit my windshield. I haven't done a long solo road trip since. Maybe that's dramatic, maybe it's smart, I don't know. What I do know is that sometimes, when a storm rolls over the hills near my apartment and the power flickers, I'll catch myself standing at the window, staring out at the tree line, half expecting to see 3 jittery beams of light weaving through the dark toward me. And even though I tell myself it was just 3 drunk guys on a mountain road with too much time and too many guns, the feeling that settled in my chest that night, that sharp, precise knowledge that I didn't belong there and that whatever those men were doing, I was not supposed to see it, has never fully gone away. If you'd been in my place, would you have stayed in the car and hoped they meant well or bailed out the way I did and hid in the woods? I'm honestly curious what you would have done. Tell me in the comments, because I still question my choices every time I think about that night. Story 3. My name is Jenna, and what I'm about to describe still feels less like a memory and more like a dream I drove through once and somehow never fully woke up from. A few months ago, my friend Alana and I were driving back home to Pittsburgh after a long weekend in Asheville, North Carolina. One of those trips we'd been talking about since college but never made time for until life finally pushed us into it. We'd spent 3 days hiking along the Blue Ridge, drinking overpriced coffee, pretending we were still 21 as we laughed ourselves sick over old stories. And when it was time to leave, I was the one who insisted we could do the drive in one straight shot instead of stopping for another night. The route our GPS chose cut us across the spine of Appalachia on a patchwork of interstates and two-lane highways, through valleys and coal towns and those little main streets that look like movie sets after everyone's gone home. We started out before dawn, taking turns driving, music up, a pile of snacks between us, the kind of road trip energy that makes the world feel manageable. But a few hours after the sun came up, as the mountains rose and fell around us in endless waves of dark green, my back started to ache from sitting and my eyes felt gritty from staring at the same strip of road. So I told Alana we should get off somewhere, grab gas, stretch, maybe find actual food instead of chips and candy. The next exit that promised more than a single gas icon on the sign was for a historic mountain town, with an arrow and a list of attractions, antiques, local dining, scenic Main Street. It sounded harmless, almost charming. We took the ramp and followed a narrow road that wound down off the highway and into a valley. Like stepping into a room where someone had just been arguing and gone silent. The streets were technically not empty. There were cars parked along the curb, signs in windows, flower baskets hanging from lampposts. But everything looked a little too faded, a little too tired, like the whole place had been put together for tourists 10 years ago, and no one had bothered to freshen it up since. Paint peeled off hand-lettered signs. Open placards hung crooked in windows where I could see no movement inside, and the few people on the sidewalks moved quickly, eyes down, as if they were late to something no one had told us about. Our first stop was a small convenience store on the edge of what passed for downtown, a squat brick building with a sun-bleached mural of a black bear on one side. I pulled into the cracked lot, and that's where the first detail that really clipped my nerves showed up. Right by the front door, instead of the usual poster about lottery tickets or cigarette prices, there was a cluttered corkboard covered in missing person flyers and grainy printouts, edges curling from sun and rain. Some were clearly old, dates from years back, but a few looked recent enough that the ink was still dark. A hiker last seen on a nearby trail, a teenage girl who never came home from a friend's house, a middle-aged man with last known address listed as one of the local hollows. Near the bottom, half tucked behind a coupon sheet, there was a Polaroid of a young woman standing in front of what looked like this very store. The same bare mural out of focus behind her. Someone had scratched her face out hard with a ballpoint pen, to the point the paper was almost torn through. Pinned over the gouged-out face was a rusted name tag that read, "Welcome back, Sarah," in faded red letters, the kind you might see on an employee's chest. I remember staring at it, feeling that subtle, irrational prickle along my spine before shaking it off and stepping inside. The interior looked normal enough in that generic fluorescent way. Rows of drinks, candy, a humming cooler full of milk and eggs. Behind the counter stood a woman maybe in her early 30s, tall, dark hair pulled into a low ponytail, a crisp white shirt tucked into black pants, suspenders holding everything in place. She had this clean, almost retro look that stood out against the mismatched chaos of the store. I only really noticed because of the contrast and because of how sharply she watched us as we walked in, not unfriendly, just intensely alert, like she was waiting for us to do something specific and we were taking too long to figure out what it was. Alana wandered over to hunt for some energy drink she loved, muttering under her breath when she didn't see it on the shelf, while I grabbed a Gatorade and made my way to the register. Up close, the cashier's eyes struck me first, a pale gray that looked almost colorless under the harsh lights. They flicked to the corkboard outside when the door opened and closed behind another customer, then back to me. There was a small scar at the corner of her mouth that made her resting expression look like the hint of a smirk. She rang me up without small talk, slid my receipt across the counter, and I headed back out to the car, expecting that to be the end of the story. But Alana still hadn't found her drink, and she gets weirdly stubborn about that sort of thing, so when she spotted another convenience store across the street, same size, different logo, she insisted we try that one too. We figured we were already off the highway. What was another 5 minutes? We crossed at the light and walked into the second store, and the moment the door shut behind us, my stomach dropped. Behind the counter stood the same woman, or someone who could have been her twin in every visible way. Same height, same dark ponytail, same colorless gray eyes, same scar pulling slightly at the corner of her mouth, same posture, hands folded flat on the counter like she was bracing herself. Her shirt and suspenders were identical too, down to the faint smudge on one strap. I felt my face telegraph my reaction before I could control it. That involuntary freezing of every muscle when you know something is wrong but haven't named it yet. Alana nudged me, asking if I saw some new brand in the cooler, but the words didn't quite land. I forced myself to take a step forward, to get a better look, thinking there had to be some difference I was missing. Something obvious that would make me feel stupid. Different eye color, a tattoo, anything. But there was nothing. She watched me watching her, eyebrows ticking up just slightly, and the air between us felt suddenly thick. It wasn't some fun coincidence anymore. It was just unsettling. I managed to ask in this half-joking tone that sounded strained even to my own ears, if she had a twin working across the street. She frowned, head tilting a fraction, and said no. She was an only child. It wasn't a playful denial. It was flat, like the question itself was somehow offensive, she added, in this clipped way that she had always worked here and didn't know what store I was talking about. The way she said always was what got to me. Subtle emphasis like a line someone had rehearsed. Alana watched the exchange, then gave me this look that said, "You're being weird, please stop." And I felt heat crawl up my neck. The mood in the room shifted, the kind of quiet that feels crowded even when there are only 3 people in a space. Suddenly, very aware of how out of place we were, we backed out with some mumbled apology and stepped into the street again, the bright daylight almost aggressive after the flickering fluorescence. Determined to prove to myself that I hadn't imagined everything, I hauled Alana back across to the first store, talking fast, describing the woman behind the counter, the scar, the suspenders, the way Shed watched us. I kept expecting the world to snap back into place the second we re-entered, like a magic trick revealing its wires. But when we pushed open the door, the woman behind the counter was entirely different. This one was short, with graying hair tucked under a ball cap, heavier set, mid-50s at least, wearing a faded polo instead of a white shirt. There was no scar, no gray-eyed stare. The energy in the store felt different too, almost bored. She barely glanced up from the lottery ticket she was scratching. I stepped aside so the door would close, heart pounding for reasons I couldn't reasonably defend, and scanned the place like maybe the first woman would be stocking shelves somewhere or heading out of the back room. But she was nowhere. When I glanced at the corkboard again on my way out, the Polaroid that had unsettled me earlier was there, but I could no longer swear it was the same one, the name tag pinned over the scratched-out face. Now said, "Congrats, Emma," in faded blue instead of "Welcome back, Sarah." Maybe I'd remembered wrong, maybe my brain had filled in details, but that small discrepancy made my skin crawl in a way I couldn't shrug off. When I told Alana I was sure it had been different 10 minutes earlier, she shrugged it off as tiredness, as all-nighter road trip brain, and I almost let myself believe her just to feel normal again. We were both eager to get out of that downtown maze, but we still needed gas, so we followed our GPS to the closest station, a slightly larger place on the edge of town. When we pulled in, the lot was almost eerily empty. Every pump wide open. No cars parked along the side, just a row of quiet islands under humming lights. There was a stray plastic bag skittering back and forth across the asphalt in the breeze and not much else. It was the middle of the morning on a weekday, in a town that advertised itself to travelers. And yet it felt like Wed arrived between acts of a play, when all the actors had slipped backstage. I parked by the nearest pump, and we went inside so I could pay, and Alana could make one last attempt to find her favorite drink. The station's small store had a nicer layout, neon beer signs and racks of road trip food, but it was just as empty as the lot, only one bored-looking cashier scrolling on his phone behind the counter. I paid, We browsed for a minute or so, maybe two, and when it was clear Alana's drink wasn't there either, we headed back out. The moment the glass door swung open, I felt like Wed walked into the wrong scene. Where there had been bare pavement minutes before, the lot was now jammed with vehicles, pickup trucks, sedans, a beat-up SUV with a ladder strapped to the roof, all crammed into every space around the pumps and clustered along the side of the building. Some had fresh mud caked thick along their tires, like they'd just come down off service roads in the hills. People milled between them, moving slowly, filling tanks, stretching their legs. There were families with kids hanging off tailgates, couples leaning against hoods, older men in work clothes. None of them should have been startling on their own. But the suddenness of it, the sheer density after such emptiness, punched the air out of my lungs. It's not like Wed'd been in there for half an hour, just a handful of minutes, and yet it felt as if everyone in a 10-mile radius had silently converged on that one spot. Eyes tracked us as we crossed the lot, not openly hostile, but sharp, assessing, holding a little too long. There was a dog tied to the side mirror of one truck, a thin hound with ribs showing. Its fur was patchy and its eyes glassy, and it stared at us without moving. Just this slow, deliberate tracking of our progress. The gas pump's digital readouts flickered oddly, numbers jumping back and forth in ways that made no sense, like they were glitching, but no one else seemed to notice. It all felt staged, like Wed stepped onto a set where everyone else knew their lines and Wed forgotten ours. Alana squeezed my arm hard enough to hurt, and that simple pressure told me she felt it too, that same eerie suspicion we hadn't been willing to name out loud yet. We decided to forget food, forget the cute local spots, and just leave. As we drove out of town, the buildings thinned, replaced by trees and steep slopes. The GPS told us we'd reconnect with the highway in about 30 minutes if we followed this winding road through the hills. Usually, that kind of drive would have been beautiful sunlight slanting through the canopy, glimpses of distant ridgelines. But now, everything felt slightly wrong, like Wed slipped half a degree off our own reality. For a while, neither of us spoke. I focused on the yellow lines, the occasional mailbox, anything concrete and familiar. Then, as we rounded a bend, a minivan passed us in the opposite lane, heading back toward the town. It was a silver Honda Odyssey or something similar, its front bumper scraped up. But what burned into my brain was the windshield, a spiderweb crack radiating from the passenger side. So large I couldn't imagine how it was still legal to drive. The crack caught the light in this fractured way that made the whole front of the car look like shattered glass, being held together by stubbornness alone. Along the passenger side door there were long, narrow scratches, as if it had been driven too close to a guardrail or a cluster of branches over and over. It was distinctive enough that both of us commented on it, making some throwaway observation about how bad you'd have to let your car get before finally fixing something like that. I wouldn't be thinking about that van now if it had only passed us once. Maybe 10 minutes later, or what felt like 10 minutes. Though it's hard to be sure we were still on that same twisting two-lane, still nowhere near the highway according to the GPS, when the exact same minivan came up behind us, close enough that I could see the cracks and scratches clearly in the rearview mirror. Then, without warning, it pulled into the opposite lane and surged past us with a low roar, the driver's face just a pale blur. The windshield fracture pattern was identical, down to the spiderweb's central point and the way one crack forked differently from the others. The same scrapes carved along the side, the same dent near the taillight. I know how memory can play tricks, how when you're tired you can convince yourself two similar things are the same. But this wasn't a case of almost, it was exact. Alana went very quiet, her hand hovering over the door handle like she was bracing against something. She whispered, more to herself than to me, that it had to be another van coincidentally damaged in the same way, but neither of us sounded convinced. I checked my mirrors constantly after that, half expecting it to reappear a third time like some mechanical ghost, but it didn't. Still, I noticed other small, unsettling details along that stretch. An abandoned house with every window boarded except one, where a curtain fluttered even though I couldn't see any glass behind it. A cluster of crude wooden crosses hammered into the ground at a curve, with no official memorial sign, their paint peeling in streaks that looked disturbingly like dried blood. A roadside picnic area where every table was covered in deep carvings of names and dates. Many of the same names repeated with different years beneath them. Maybe they were nothing, just the kind of off things you find in rural areas if you pay too much attention. But each one compounded the unease already coiled in my gut. At some point, after we'd finally outrun the worst of that feeling and the trees thinned enough for the highway signs to reappear, I glanced down at the GPS and realized the time didn't make sense. According to the little digital clock, more than an hour had passed since the gas station, but by my rough mental math, it felt like half that. The ETA to Pittsburgh had jumped, adding extra minutes as if we'd been standing still. I wanted to tell Alana to put that strange discrepancy into words and maybe laugh it off together. But she looked so tightly wound in the passenger seat, fingers digging into her knees, that I kept it to myself. Instead, I focused on merging back onto the interstate, grateful for the ugly familiarity of big trucks and rest area billboards. The rest of the trip was uneventful. By the time we pulled into my apartment complex after dark, the town felt like something we'd driven through days ago instead of that morning. We unpacked, hugged, promised to text, tried to act like normal people being normal after a normal road trip. But that night, lying in bed, my brain reeled back through every oddity: the twin cashiers who weren't twins, the changing Polaroid, the empty gas station lot that turned into a packed crowd in minutes, the cracked minivan that somehow both passed us and then passed us again, the way everyone's eyes in that lot had lingered on us with an intensity I still don't know how to classify. I've tried to research the name of the town since then, but the funny thing is, I cannot for the life of me remember what it was actually called. I remember the mural, the corkboard, the vague promises on the highway sign, but the name itself slips every time I try to grab it, like waking from a dream and losing the details as soon as you sit up. I've read enough stories online from people who had strange experiences in out-of-the-way places, time that doesn't add up, people who seem duplicated, towns that feel a degree off from reality, to know we're not the only ones. Still, there's something uniquely unsettling about the way my gut reacted that day. Like every bone in my body was quietly telling me to leave, while my brain kept saying there's nothing technically wrong here. I don't expect a clear explanation, and maybe there isn't one, but I think about it every time I see an exit for a historic downtown in the middle of nowhere, and wonder what's waiting if you take it. If you've ever driven through a town that felt wrong in a way you couldn't explain, or seen the same car or person twice where it didn't make sense, I'd honestly like to hear about it. Tell me in the comments how you make sense of what happened to us, because I'm still not sure I'd have tried every possible story yet.